Good morning. Welcome everyone to this webinar and release of our new report on state-based visas. I'm Teresa Cardinal Brown, and I am Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and I'm happy to be your moderator this morning. For those not familiar with BPC, we are a think tank in Washington, D.C., founded by 4 former Senate Majority Leaders, Bob Dole, Tom Daschle, George Mitchell, and Howard Baker. And we work to bring the political parties together to develop practical solutions to the country's biggest problems. Today, we are releasing our latest report, Immigration at the State Level, an examination of proposed state-based visa programs in the United States. You can find this report on our website at www.bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. For those of you who are viewing us in Zoom, you'll see a link to the report posted in the chat. As the United States continues to debate immigration as an issue and what our immigration system should look like, states have been engaged similarly in discussions about their role in the immigration system. This report, which was commissioned by BPC and authored by the esteemed Michelle Waslin, takes a look at the history of immigration federalism in the United States, how other countries such as Canada and Australia include regional perspectives in their immigration systems, and various proposals that states have put forward for state-based visas. Michelle will present the key findings of a report, and then we will have a discussion with a couple of distinguished panelists whom I will introduce following Michelle's presentation. We will save time for Q&A from the audience at the end of our discussion. So a few housekeeping notes. If you are watching this in Zoom, you have the opportunity to post questions to the panel via the Q&A window. That window will be moderated by BPC staff. And so if you see that your question has been answered, that means your question has been forwarded to us to consider for answer. We will try to get to as many questions as possible, but in this format, we may not get to all of them, so please be patient. If you are watching via the webcast or on YouTube, you can also submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag BPCLive, and our staff will be monitoring that, and we'll post those questions to the Q&A for us to answer as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce Michelle Waslin. Michelle is Program Coordinator at the Institute for Immigration Research at George Mason University in Northern Virginia. In her role, she tracks and analyzes immigration research and policy, writes on related topics, and coordinates the work of the IIR, building relationships with academics and other experts. Prior to joining the IIR, she was a senior policy analyst at the American Immigration Council, and before that, she was a manager of the Immigration in the States project at Pew Charitable Trusts, which is directly relevant to the work she did for us on this report. She also has been Director of Immigration Policy at UNIDOS US, previously the National Council of La Raza. I will note that Michelle authored this report in her personal capacity and will issue a disclaimer that the report does not necessarily represent the views of her current or former employers, but we are very happy that she undertook this research for us based on her personal experience and expertise. Thank you, Michelle, and go ahead and talk to us about the report, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Teresa. Thank you so much to the Bipartisan Policy Center for inviting me to be a part of this project and for your support throughout this entire process. So our overarching question today is, what role should states play in immigration policy? Currently, we have 50 states, and there is much variation in terms of their population size and demographics, economies, their industries, their workforces. Some states are experiencing population loss and labor shortages, while others are not. But we have one national immigration system. It's the federal government that has sole authority to admit immigrants, to determine how many immigrants to admit, and what types of immigrants to admit. State governments do not play a role in the immigration system. They generally do not have any authority over how many people and what types of immigrants settle there. It's actually the employers who petition for foreign workers on either a permanent or a temporary basis, but of course not every employer gets the workers that they want or they need. Also, many immigrants are admitted as family members or as refugees or asylees or any other classification. And the people that are admitted under those categories work. But states don't have the ability to request workers or family members or refugees with certain skills that match their labor needs. And furthermore, there are approximately 7.6 million unauthorized immigrants in the civilian labor force. And these workers are filling gaps in the labor force in many states. But the states cannot legalize their status under current immigration law. Congress can reform the US immigration system and can create a program that elevates the role of the states. And other countries already have these systems in place. Canada and Australia have already implemented regional immigration systems in which the national government works closely with the provincial, territorial, or regional governments to distribute foreign workers to the areas where they're most needed. But here in the United States, there are no such programs. But states can apply pressure on the federal government to change the laws. And one of the ways they do this is by introducing legislation and passing state laws that send a strong message to the federal government. In the last 2 decades or so, the states have introduced and passed unprecedented numbers of immigration-related legislation. And among these, both Republicans and Democrats in at least 16 states have introduced proposals to give the state a larger role in obtaining additional immigrant workers. Now in the paper, I list all of these bills and categorize them. Here I will be very brief. First, legislators in several states have urged the federal government to create entirely new guest worker programs. Second, other legislators have proposed expanding the existing H-2A and H-2B programs to allow for additional seasonal agricultural and non-agricultural workers to work in those states. Legislators in some other states have proposed creating and administering their own visa programs. And finally, other state legislators focus their proposals on granting temporary work visas for unauthorized workers working in that state. Now, the vast majority of these bills died early in the legislative process. Only Colorado and Utah passed laws that would have created a guest worker program, but these laws were never implemented. Now, all of these state bills have a few things in common. First, most focus on guest worker programs, and they're not proposing immediate green cards or permanent immigration, although some of them suggest that a guest worker could eventually adjust to permanent status. Most of the proposals were focused on agriculture, landscaping, construction, and the service industry, but very few were focused specifically on high-skilled workers. The other big thing they had in common is they acknowledge that they may not move forward without permission from the federal government. Some requested permission, others requested federal waivers, although there's no provision of US law that could be waived to allow these programs to move forward. So the states understand that they need federal support, but the executive branch of the US government has not been very receptive. In fact, in 2011, the Department of Justice threatened to sue Utah over its guest worker program, stating that it was preempted by federal law. It is pretty clear that states cannot create their own guest worker programs. They cannot admit immigrants, they can't stamp a visa on their passports, they cannot issue work authorization. But if they choose to do so, Congress can pass a law creating an additional role for the states or creating a visa program designed to meet individual states' needs. And in fact, several members of Congress have introduced this type of legislation. In 2017, the state-sponsored Visa Pilot Program Act was introduced by Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, and that bill was introduced again in 2019 by Representative John Curtis of Utah. This bill would create a new W visa classification for foreign workers, and states could choose to participate or not. A number of W visas would be distributed among the participating states, and that number of W visas could be adjusted in future years. Congress included some basic eligibility criteria, but the states could choose to apply W visas to unauthorized immigrants or only to new foreign workers, and the states could create additional eligibility criteria for workers, eligibility criteria for employers. They could introduce geographic restrictions on where the workers could work within the state. States could also choose to enter into compacts with other states, thereby allowing workers to cross state lines. In other words, the states would have a great deal of discretion to shape the program to meet their own needs. Now, that bill has not gotten much momentum in Congress, and of course, no immigration reform legislation has recently. And at this moment, with a global pandemic and high unemployment rates, it seems unlikely that Congress will pass immigration reform in the near future. But when we emerge from this crisis, and we will, and when Congress again begins to consider immigration and state-based visas, they need to keep several issues in mind. There are several things that policymakers must tackle to ensure that they create a thoughtful, rational, and successful program. First, what type of program will this be? Will Congress create a new temporary worker program or the expansion of an existing guest worker program? Or will it be a green card program for permanent immigration? Each of these options raises questions regarding the number of visas that will be made available, where those visa numbers come from, and how they will be allocated. There are also questions about what this visa will look like. There are numerous details regarding eligibility requirements, visa duration, adjustment to permanent residency, eligibility for family members, what fees will be charged, and how workers will be recruited. Will Congress mandate these visa characteristics, or will they grant states the authority to tailor these criteria to address their own needs? Compliance and enforcement. What mechanisms could be put in place to ensure that states, employers, and workers are complying with the program? And how will compliance be enforced? Also very important, how will states use their allotment of visas to the best benefit of the state? How will states decide whether or not to participate? Would they use their visas to attract additional high-skilled workers or low-skilled workers, or some combination? Should they focus on unauthorized immigrants that are already living and working in the state? And maybe most importantly, how will states determine how many workers are needed? What data and mechanisms are needed to measure labor shortages? Will the program include a periodic evaluation to determine whether it's meeting its stated objectives? This probably means mandating consistent, reliable data collection to confirm that the program is successfully matching workers to the labor market. And again, I think the big question is, what is the balance between federal and state authority? How many of the details should be mandated by Congress, and how much flexibility should be delegated to the states? There are many more details in this paper that I cannot possibly go into right now, and I do encourage you to read the paper. But I will conclude by saying that it is worth considering a state-based visa as part of a new legal immigration system for the 21st century. The current economic downturn has hit states very unevenly, and states will emerge from it unevenly. And a more flexible system that's responsive to state needs might provide us with a way forward. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion with my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And now I will introduce our other guests for our discussion. Ann Morse is the Federal Affairs Counsel for the National Conference of State Legislatures Immigration Policy Project. Prior to her role as Federal Affairs Counsel, she served as NCSL's Immigration Policy Project Program Director for 28 years, where she directed NCSL's Executive Committee Task Force on Immigration and the State. She is also an adjunct professor at George Washington University, her alma mater, where she teaches state and intergovernmental politics. The Honorable John Hostetler is the Vice President for Federal Affairs for States Trust, a project of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. He served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1995 to 2007, representing Indiana's 8th District in southwestern Indiana. Since leaving Congress, Hostetler has launched a publishing company, Publius House, and authored 2 books. He also founded the Constitution Institute, which holds seminars throughout Indiana teaching about the U.S. Constitution. Welcome, Congressman Hostetler and Ann.
Good to be with you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. So I'm going to start with Ann. Ann, let me ask you from your perspective, since you have been around and working with state legislatures throughout the period that Michelle was talking about when all of these state-based legislative actions were initiated, what do you think is driving these proposals from state legislatures?
Hi, thanks, Teresa. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Thanks for the opportunity. Well, I had not expected to spend my entire career on immigration policy. It started as a very short project, and then as states learned more, they decided that they clearly had a lot of opportunity to act in this field. When we started working on it, it was there was no such thing as immigrant policy. It was, as Michelle pointed out, totally a federal responsibility, and states were working around the edges. When my task force was created at NCSL, the Task Force on Immigration in the States, it was created during an era of optimism, if you will, around immigration reform. In 2005, there was actually hope that immigration reform could be advanced in Congress. Our bipartisan task force met with experts and legislators from various fields, and within about 5 months put together a comprehensive immigration reform policy that addressed enforcement and integration aspects of immigration reform. What I'd like to say is that to get to your question, what I'd like to say is that I think the lack of federal action is a primary driver of why states are attempting to advance immigration reforms within their communities and at the national level. Michelle mentioned immigration federalism a couple of times, and I think that is exactly where states are trying to have an impact. If the federal government is unable to get out of its gridlock and pass immigration reform, what can states do for immigrants in their communities, either to attract needed workers or to help them become educated, get the needed health care? Basically, there's a lot of consensus among our legislators around safe streets, strong economies. So that's I'll start with that. I think there's a lot of interest in states working in these various policy arenas and trying to get some solutions out there.
So Congressman Hostetler, Ann mentioned the idea of federalism in this issue, and you come to this issue from a federalism perspective as part of the States Trust at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. How do you see the role of states in the immigration system, and why do you think they should play a greater role?
Well, first of all, Teresa, I want to thank you and Rachel and all the work you've done in the Bipartisan Policy Center for bringing this very important discussion to bear, and for Dr. Waslin's very important contribution to this discussion. And to just say that to your point of federalism, I personally am very excited that we're talking about federalism. We're talking about immigration in the context of federalism. And lest anyone hearing about this conversation, this webinar, and suggesting that there's something subversive going on here, that the states are wanting to take more of the charge of immigration policy. It is a very American tradition to be frustrated by a strong central government that's not moving on immigration policies. If you read the Declaration of Independence, among the litany of complaints that Thomas Jefferson and his brethren in Philadelphia added against the king, one of those had to do with the fact that the king had frustrated the process of enacting immigration laws and for other laws regarding the migration into the colonies. And so this is before we were the United States of America, this was a concern here. And where we fast forward to today, and states are finding that the federal government once again is not operating in the context of meeting the needs of local economies and communities in this area. And so we are very excited that this is a bipartisan, across the ideological spectrum of discussion what states can do. In fact, in our statement of principles, in a border security coalition that we started, that the Texas Public Policy Foundation initiated last year, we say that states like Texas should be collaborators in immigration policy, because states have different needs with regards, and we've had already discussion this morning about the diversity in states with regard to their needs of a workforce, their cultural desires, and the like. And this is something that we should be engaged in, and we shouldn't be reserved in our voice in saying that states can play an active role, and states should play an important role in deciding those individuals within their borders. So we very much appreciate this conversation, this discussion, and hope for much more and fruitful endeavors in the future.
Thank you. Michelle, let me go back to your paper. You heard the congressman talk a little bit about the founding of our country. Your paper goes into a little more history here, that early on in the United States history, it was states that actually controlled immigration, and then we transitioned to more federal control. But in other countries, you mentioned Canada and Australia, they do, in their modern era, work closely with their subnational governments. Can you talk a little bit about the history there and talk a little bit about how Canada and Australia manage it? Oh, you're on mute.
Oops. I'm happy to talk about that. Thank you for the question. Yes, early in American history, it was really the states and the ports in those early states that were responsible for admitting immigrants. It wasn't until late in the 1800s that the United States federal government kind of took over immigration policy and established the first Office of Immigration and established the first immigration enforcement mechanisms. So the states did play a large role early in the history. In terms of Canada and Australia, first of all, I must say I'm no expert in Canadian and Australian immigration policy, but we do know that in Canada, their constitution actually states that immigration policy is a partnership between the national government and the subnational governments. And they have a strong history of the federal government working closely with their provincial governments to determine who is going to be admitted as immigrants. And there they have two different programs that allow the provincial governments to nominate immigrants that they want to live and work in their province. Then the federal government kind of takes over and does the actual admissions, does the background checks, that type of thing. And then those immigrants go and live in the province that nominated them. They are admitted as permanent residents. So once they enter the country, they can go anywhere within Canada. But a recent evaluation found that most of them do remain within the province that nominated them. In Australia, it's a more recent development, and this type of immigration federalism is not mandated by the Australian Constitution. But for the last couple of decades, they have also had these regional immigration policies that allow employers or the regional governments in some cases to nominate the workers that they need to live and work within specific provinces. Then they are admitted. They are expected to remain in that province for a period of years, after which they can apply for permanent residency and can move anywhere within the country.
Thanks. And so from what you know about these compacts and the other state legislative proposals and the work you've done with your task force, what have you heard from your members? Why are state legislatures getting involved here? And do you think it's mostly political statements, or do you think that states really do want to take on more of this responsibility?
Okay, first is the thing I hear most from legislators is we need strong economies, we need jobs, we have some of our population may be leaving the states, the baby boomers are retiring. This is all about the economy. The people that have been working on the task force bring their lived experience with them about their occupations. As you probably know, legislatures are not full-time people, full-time jobs. They're in session usually January through March, and they have other jobs. And many of them that are serving on the task force that are working with ranchers and farmers who can't get the help they need. They can't bring in the crops. The phrase I hear most often is, we have crops rotting in the fields and nobody to pick them. So I think they're working from a sense of urgency. How do we get our economy growing? How do we feed people? How do we assure food security? They're very practical. They want to get a solution. The public does not want to hear that it's not their responsibility to go and get the help that's needed for the community. I wanted to touch a little bit on Colorado and Utah because they were the first states and went the farthest in trying to work with the federal government. Colorado's idea was to help administer, and this is an area where this is common. Federal government creates programs and states implement them. So they attempted to identify a way that they could mediate between the federal government's responsibility to admit and manage that they would have safe housing and that the people had good background checks, or that the labor contractors were had the good housekeeping seal of approval, if you will, at the state level so that they could operate. Utah took the direction of bringing that social compact, as Michelle mentioned, bringing a lot of stakeholders together, the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Salt Lake Chamber of Commerce, and bringing the public along so that they knew what the legislature was going to do. And their slate of bills was talked about at NCSL conferences and tested. And then when they went forward, it was everybody knew what the package was supposed to do. And they then, of course, ran into the federal barrier. So I think states are trying to be creative, and it's just trying to get things across the line.
Congressman Hostetler, when you served in Congress, you were part of the immigration subcommittee and you saw the federal role. But we've heard that Congress has not been quite receptive to this idea. What do you think are some of the issues from the federal perspective from Congress in this? And do you think it's an issue that could gain bipartisan support?
Well, you're correct, Teresa. Previously, I was part of the problem when I was in Congress, and we had a lot of issues that we addressed on the subcommittee and in the Congress in general. I think the barrier that is in Congress overwhelmingly is this notion that it is the federal prerogative to determine who comes into the United States of America collectively as a whole, I guess I should say. And that is quite a hurdle. I remember when I took this job initially at Texas Public Policy Foundation, I had an interview with a reporter from Texas that covered issues in Washington, D.C. And when I talked to her about the desire to allow states to have more say in immigration policy, she questioned that. And having been in Washington, D.C. as long as she was, she herself could not understand the idea of the states taking more part in this whole process. And it's going to take an education effort. It's going to take an education effort across the ideological spectrum. And the Bipartisan Policy Center is doing that. We're doing that at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. A report that we published last year looked at the Canadian and Australian systems directly and took a deep dive into them and basically got us to thinking that Australia and Canada are doing federalism better than the United States, and that just should not be the case. But it's going to take quite an effort to change the thinking in Washington, D.C., especially on Capitol Hill, that, to Dr. Waslin's point in her paper, and a little bit that we do touch on briefly on ours, is that this wasn't always a federal issue. It wasn't federal policy, it was state policy. And so it's not unheard of to want to return to that, especially as is the case today when Congress is not responding in a timely fashion to meet the needs of the states. And so education is imperative to overcome this barrier.
So Michelle, going back to your report, I think you mentioned early on, it's true that states themselves don't necessarily have the same needs or desires. Not every state might want to do this. But we have a national and federal policy that supposedly does take into account, at least, in some way, the economic condition of the country. But why is that not sufficient for, admitting people to the United States to serve in particular places or particular needs or particular industries?
Right. So through our current employment-based immigration system, employers are able to petition for the workers that they need when they can prove that they have a labor shortage, that there is a job available, and that they have tried to get American workers to take that job, and that they have not been successful. So they need a foreign worker, right? So employers have to go through these hoops to prove that there is this need for foreign workers. Which sounds great, but in reality, we know that there are numerical limits on how many of those visas are allowed. So some employers petition for the workers they need, and they're not able to get them, right? So that means that even if there has been a proven labor need in a state, they may not be able to get the types of workers that they need. And then when employers are, when they do petition for workers, most times those workers need to remain with that same employer, and they're not able to really move to other areas of the state or other jobs that might need them more. So the system is imperfect, and some places, just kind of through sheer luck, are not able to get the visas that they need. But a state-based visa could respond to some of those needs. Congress creates these visa classifications. Congress has determined that employers can petition for a certain number of workers. They've also determined that family members can petition for certain family members. It's Congress that creates these categories, right? So Congress could create a new category that allows state governments to be part of this process, right? For state governments to determine what their labor needs are and to be able to receive the workers that they need and not have to go through the individual employers to do so. And states could participate if they want to, or they don't have to participate, right? And it could just be a much more nimble, flexible system. And it doesn't mean that the entire immigration system would be changed to a state-based system. I think we want to make that clear, that we're talking about one piece of the immigration system. It doesn't mean overriding our entire current system for this new one.
So Anne, let me ask you, you mentioned that the overriding issue for most of your members and the state legislators that you've talked to on this is workforce, but they often cite, agriculture, construction, sort of the lesser skilled. Are there also states that are looking at the high skilled issues, or have most of these proposals focused on those particular needs? And why do you think that is? Do they believe that the immigration system isn't serving them with those particular workforce needs, or some other reason?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way we look at the states are looking at their workforces, over time, what I've heard from legislators say is that there's shortages in STEM fields, there's shortages in health professionals, particularly for rural states like Georgia has often said that they have very few health professionals per capita, and they're really, really appreciative of things like the Conrad 30 program, which I think was in Michelle's paper, where this allows a certain number of health professionals to stay and work in the state in underserved areas, and it's been a really well appreciated program. I have heard from places like Washington State where Microsoft, I think it was, could not get the STEM workers that it needed, and it opened a business across the border in Canada, so it wouldn't lose the access to that global talent. The latest trend that I've been seeing in the States has been moving into occupational licenses, again, because they're seeing labor shortages in so many fields. How can we help streamline the process, still keep it highly accountable, but make sure that foreign professionals with the skills that we need can get into the field that we so desperately need them to help out with. I think what states are saying is that they're the first responders to the local economies. They're the ones that can see on the ground what their economies need, what their businesses need. And the other point I'd like to make is that we're not only filling jobs with foreign workers, but foreign workers help grow a business so that the entire community is growing along with the workforce that we're asking to come from abroad and help.
Thank you. So Congressman Hostetler, I think you and you hear this issue about different states have different needs. You mentioned earlier that different states may have different desires for the kinds of immigrants to settle, and not every state has the same needs. Why do you think it's important that states be able to get those, if we have a system that's just specifically employer-based, how would that not be sufficient if a state is looking, for example, to attract a certain type of business or workforce? And you're on mute, sir.
Well, states have different needs, and it's important that these states can take the initiative to apply for visas, to apply for workers to come in to meet those needs. One thing I did not address in my response to your earlier question deals with this with regard to the diversity of states. And that is one concern that seems to predominate is the movement of individuals. If, for example, if a state-based visa system was put in place and you had state X that had a significant need of a particular type of workers or workers in general, neighboring state Y may not have that same need and may in fact be under some economic duress. The concern would be the movement of individuals across state lines. And so that is an issue that would have to be addressed. And I think Dr. Waslin talks about that somewhat in her paper. So that would be a concern that would have to be addressed in the program. And that's a very controversial topic, I understand. But it does address the issue underlying federalism. Not all states have the same needs, and to the extent that one state is benefited by this program, other states at varying times may not be benefited by their neighbors allowing the immigration of individuals into those states based on their system, based on the national system and the needs of that particular state. So I do believe we should allow states much more flexibility, much more say in who they permit into their states, and we have to recognize the concerns of others that, well, not the concerns of others, just the concerns of states generally, to be able to determine the benefit of foreign workers in their states as well.
So Michelle, looking at the state proposals that you covered in your paper, did you see a distinction between sort of more Republican legislators and governments and Democratic states, or red states and blue states, and the kinds of things that they were proposing, or is there some commonalities there?
It was actually surprising how many commonalities there were. There were proposals from, every state from California and Texas and Colorado to Kansas and Oklahoma and Georgia. And, of course, when a bill is introduced, it might be introduced by a single legislator in a state. And so it's not indicative of the mood of the entire state. But I did see a lot of commonalities. And when you read through the legislation, which I recommend that people do, it's kind of fun to read the beginning paragraphs where they kind of set out, this is why we're introducing this piece of legislation. And there were just very strong statements about the failure of the federal immigration system, the failure of Congress to reform the system, the need for workers, the fact that there is a large unauthorized immigrant population living in the state and that no action has been taken about that. It was just really interesting to read the very strong convictions with which these state legislatures introduced their bills.
Yeah. So, Anne, how much voice do the state legislators have in Washington? Have they been invited to the table when Congress is considering federal legislation? Have they gone to the table to make their needs known? And how has that been received? I mean, I think it sounds like a lot of the states are introducing their own legislation just because they want to make sure that they have that seat at the table in the federal discussion.
Yeah, I would say it's not for lack of trying, Teresa. I think our members are talking to the delegations constantly about the needs in their communities. We wish they would take our advice more often. So let me offer a positive note. I was impressed to see the Agricultural Farm Workforce Modernization Act pass in December of last year, something where all stakeholders came together and hammered out a difficult compromise, and everybody seemed very happy with it. It passed at a high level, and it's something that an area of immigration policy that is seen as a consensus area. We absolutely need workers in the field. This is not something that the average American is able or willing to do, and these jobs are not where the people are. So let's create some more educational opportunities between Congress and the public and state legislators. State legislators obviously have been working on this for a long time, crafting compromise proposals in their states, addressing solutions piecemeal sometimes, comprehensively other times. I think there's a lot of areas that we could actually move forward on. I'd like to see something around healthcare. I think that's another commonality. Something that just kind of says, this is practical, this is positive. Let states be laboratories of democracy. And you knew I had to say that once. But I think it's an area where we can come together and not have this polarizing debate. We can do immigration reform. We passed it through the chambers of Congress before. We just have to settle down and figure out what is it that brings everybody to the table this time.
So Congressman Hostetler, again, going back to your experience on Capitol Hill, did you hear from your state legislators on these issues when you were there? Did your colleagues hear from the states on these issues? And how much credence do you pay to that versus other voices that you hear more regularly?
Well, no, I'm a little bit of part of ancient history here in that my last term as chairman of the subcommittee ended in 2007. We didn't hear a lot from state legislatures, but I think this is a problem. This is an issue that has evolved. And when I say problem, the problem that the federal government just continues to not be able to come together on reform of the national immigration system, that now you've seen this almost geometric rise in states working toward solving this problem on their own. And so this is going to, I think, do nothing but continue. And so I'm glad to see that. And I'm glad to see that state legislators are taking upon themselves to come to Washington, D.C. and voice their concerns more so than might have been the case in the early part of this century, whenever I was chairman of the committee. But once again, it's going to take education like this particular program, this webinar, to begin to address that 800-pound gorilla in the room that doesn't really, it should not be taken so much for granted or as fact, and that is the states can take an active role, should take an active role. There's a historical basis for it, and that basis is coming home today and should be applied. So
Michelle, both from your work in putting together the paper, but also your history working with immigration issues, some, I think, maybe more on the Democratic side, and certainly immigration advocates in the current day and age may be concerned about giving states more ability to engage in the process because states may be more restrictive than they might like. The congressman talked about different states would have different interest and or tolerance for some of this. The president made waves when he issued a proclamation that required states and counties to affirmatively agree to refugee resettlement. And that created a lot of controversy because perhaps he believed that many would say no, and in fact, most said yes. But what do you think are sort of the flip side of this? Why would there be concern about giving states more authority in this area?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that there is concern that if you would say to all 50 states, you can choose to allow immigrants in your state or not, certainly some states may determine that they don't want immigrants. And I think that would be very unfortunate. But on the other hand, I think we saw with the refugee situation, with that executive order, when states were asked to affirmatively say that they wanted to resettle refugees, the vast majority of states and localities did say that they wanted to continue to resettle refugees. It's the federal government that admits immigrants, but immigrants are people, right? And they live in states and localities. And the states and localities that are really most aware of the daily activity of immigrant communities, right? Immigrants are, they're people, they work, they're workers, they're consumers, they're taxpayers, they're homeowners. There are a lot of benefits that immigrant communities bring to states and localities. And I think that the state and local governments are well aware of those benefits and how states help their local economies. I also think that it would be important that if states were allowed to make these determinations to a greater extent, there needs to be a lot of communication within that state, right? That I think that governors and state legislators would have to consult with a lot of different sectors within the state, not just the Chamber of Commerce, right? Not just employers, but they would have to work with immigrant rights organizations, civil rights organizations, faith-based groups, with organized labor. And I think that would be important to get a really good sense of the need for immigrants and the benefits that immigrants bring to a particular area. And that way, states would have a more well-rounded perspective and a better ability to make those decisions.
So Anne, coming back to you and your perspective, and based on what Michelle said, do you agree that states have a good sense of the communities that reside there and what they would be okay with and welcoming?
Yeah, by and large, I think they do. And I wanted to, thanks for bringing up the refugee resettlement program, because it's something that we don't talk enough about the successes of that program. It's one of the few federally funded case management programs, refugee cash, refugee medical, help with getting people jobs, help with learning English, help with integrating into society, and it works. It was created in 1980. It's something that is a partnership among the federal government, the states, and local community organizations. And the thing that has faltered in some places has been that coordination, has been that communication, so that it works so well, people don't even know it. So the places that it's not working, that's when they end up in the hospital rooms. They've run out of their federal insurance and they're relying on state and local communities. We had this apocryphal story once where they were resettling refugees into Fargo, North Dakota during a flood. Obviously, that kind of thing shouldn't happen. But you're not hearing a lot of bad stories because it's working well. I mean, it does need to be brought in the 21st century, just like all of the immigration system. We have a lot of fixes that we need to make, but where you've got a system where you have a person that's placed in a community with the education system knowing they're there, the health system knowing they're there, they get the short-term supports they need, and they go on to lead long, productive lives fulfilling the American dream. I really think it's a great success story that needs to be returned to.
So Congressman Hostetler, I mean, Anne mentioned the refugee resettlement program, which does have some specific roles for the states after refugees are resettled. The federal government resettles them, and then states have some requirements on them. But immigration isn't the only place where states and the federal government partner, right? There's a lot of other programs where the federal government sets out broad parameters, and then the states have to implement it. Why do you think immigration may be different from some of those programs?
Well,
or should it be?
Oh, yes, and it will be. Immigration will be different because of the nature of bringing more people into an economy, more people into a culture that was previously not their own. The issue of assimilation is a major issue, and so that will take place. With regard to refugee resettlement, you know, there were some states that decided to take a pause. For example, Texas said this year said no, because if you look historically at Texas has historically taken what you might consider more than their fair share. And given the massive internal immigration in the country of people migrating to Texas from California and elsewhere, Texas decided to, you know, put a pause with regard to refugee resettlement. I don't think that pause will be continual, but this idea of federalism to allow states, and to the point that Dr. Waslin and Ann have made several times here, in Washington, D.C., we need to just get a better understanding that to this very important point, that state legislators, local government is really literally much closer to the people than folks on Capitol Hill are, if nothing else, in the nature of where they work. And so we can trust state legislatures and local governing entities to decide what is best for their communities and what is best for their states in a host of areas. For example, as you mentioned, with regard to infrastructure projects, state and federal governments decide where highways go, decide on sewer projects, decide on a myriad of things that the federal government acts as a backstop, you might say, and as a funder. But we can trust state and local governments to make these decisions because they will ultimately be, I think, more responsive to the needs of their community, one way or another. With regard to immigration policy, if we, the people in our respective states, decide that a state legislator, a state legislature, has made a bad decision regarding policy X, then there'll be choices that will be made electorally. And it happens on the federal level as well too. I'm a personal recipient of both sides of that electoral response. So, but we can trust state and local governments. My son is a state legislator in Indiana. And so he hears from his family all the time about issues that are important to them at the dinner table. So we can understand that state governments will be responsive and will make very good choices in this. In the early days, there's going to be a process whereby states will make some mistakes and will make some very good choices. But as to the point that Ann made earlier about laboratories of democracy, we can trust them.
Yeah. So Michelle, one of the questions I have is that, obviously immigration at the national level is a controversial issue. It's very heavily debated, quite polarized in the way it's discussed. We've done some polling, and I know when you were at Pew, you saw some polling as well, that part of the issue is that the public kind of, one, doesn't understand the federal immigration system at all, and two, feels like it's fairly removed from them and not responsive, I guess is one way to put it. Do you think that having states more involved might actually close some of that gap, or the public would feel more confident that it's more responsive, that their local government has more say in it?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, that currently there's a lot of anti-Washington, D.C. sentiment, right? And there's this feeling that D.C. is not working well and it's not working for them. So I think that's a distinct possibility, that if a state had a process for deciding, let's say, whether or not to participate in a state-based visa program, and they could have a variety of hearings, they could have town hall events, they could do internal polling, they could, like I said earlier, meet with a variety of faith-based organizations, labor groups, chambers of commerce, and really have this discussion at the state level. I think that would be a great educational opportunity, right? To educate the public about how the current immigration system works, what's working well and what's not working so well, and give them a better sense of how immigrants are integrating in their state and what the economic and fiscal contributions immigrants are making. So I think that might be a really great opportunity to get beyond the DC noise and to have a more civil conversation at a local level.
And so, but working with state legislatures, do you see that happening in state legislatures? Do you think that they are now and or capable of taking on that kind of broad community-based discussion and deciding these things?
Well, I keep going back to the public education need here, because immigration is, as I've been told over time, is the second longest in the US code after the tax code. This is a really complex system, and so it can be hard to digest. But when you start to pull it out into the basic facts of what a community needs, okay, we need healthcare workers. Okay, we need people to pick crops or pick apples. Where are the gaps that we cannot fill because we want to retire or we want to move on to higher different jobs? We're growing. One day again, will be a growing economy. But I think where we have an opportunity to educate is, for example, looking at law enforcement. Law enforcement always talks to us about engaging in the priorities of the safe streets at home, making sure we're protected against violent criminals. They don't want to be enforcing federal civil immigration law. There's paperwork problems, but they do want to have the trust of their community. So if there's a crime, you have a victim willing to come forward or a witness willing to come forward. And that means that you have to have trust in the community, and getting the actual members of the citizens of that community talking about where where their needs are, who is in the community. So there's a no surprises rule, if you will, that we have people coming from this country to do X work, and they'll be here for 3 years because it's temporary, or they'll be here permanently. So let's make sure they have good English skills and civic skills, and they have the rights and responsibilities of being a citizen in this community.
Yeah, and Anne, as you well know, I mean, the most of the integration efforts happen, and I know Michelle knows this, at the state and local level. There's not a lot of federal involvement in immigrant integration, unlike other countries that have, especially Canada, I know has a major federal integration setup and program. So do you think that is also a reason that states, want to be more involved in all of this?
Well, absolutely. Once you have somebody in your community, you want to make sure they're connected and they're successful. So states have spent a lot of time working on providing English language classes, providing tutoring, providing naturalization. There was a big program with the Colorado Trust some years back about investing in integration programs all across the state. And they had Aurora do this great job of teaching older people who were barred by federal bars from having access to programs, but getting them that little extra help so that they got their English and civics, they could pass the naturalization test and have a little bit of income security in their older years. So they wouldn't be depending on state and local communities where there might not be the help. I think there's a lot of opportunity to learn from what states have done in various civics classes, job support classes, the refugee vocational ESL classes, where you're able to navigate and make sure that people are able to communicate. One of the biggest hurdles I've heard over time from critics of the program is that people come here and they don't speak English, so they're not part of our community. Well, this is one area that we can absolutely be active in.
Mm-hmm. Congressman, going back to sort of the federal government and how we could get them maybe to be more receptive to these kind of issues and concerns, what do you think needs to change or happen in Washington that would open up this discussion a little more?
Well, there has to be an education of members. There has to be an understanding that the federal government has not been responsive. I mean, members of Congress know this. This is an issue that consumes so much time, you might say, behind the scenes in virtually every office on Capitol Hill. And when we go into offices to talk about the immigration policy issue, we run the gambit in responses to, oh my gosh, here comes this discussion again, to we're so excited that you're here to talk about this. But it does take a lot of time in Washington, D.C. And I think what you're doing here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, what we're trying to do overall with a broad ideological spectrum approach to this, is to set the groundwork to make members of Congress feel easier about allowing states to take more of this on. When Congress realizes that anytime you can relieve members of Congress of one of the most controversial issues on their plate, they're welcome to it. But they feel if we can't make the argument, which I think is being made in papers like ours in last year and Dr. Waslin's most recently, if we can't make those good arguments to relieve members of Congress of some of this burden, then they're going to hold on to it, and we've got to be willing to say states can take this on. This is not unprecedented in the history of our union. This is something that some states will get right at the beginning, some states will get wrong at the beginning, but it's not going to be, how can I say this grammatically? It's not going to be any more wrong for certain states to get it to engage in this than what the federal government is doing now. And so there has to be a bipartisan across the ideological spectrum approach to making Congress feel easy, members of Congress feel easy about alleviating them, at least of some of the burden of this very controversial topic.
It's interesting to hear you say that Congress would like not to have to legislate on this issue. I think,
and I could give you a litany of issues that they would love to not have to deal with. But, there is this, it's our job. And we are not going to shirk our responsibilities as we shirk our responsibilities in making the necessary reform to fix this problem.
Yeah, thank you. So we have several questions that have come in. So I'm going to turn to the questions we've received from our audience. And I want to thank you for engaging in those. If you have questions and you're on the Zoom platform, again, you can send them via the Q&A section. If you are watching via our website or on YouTube, you can tweet at us at #BPC Live, and those questions will come in as well. The first question asks Michelle, and Anne, I think you can answer this too. Some of the proposals were state compacts that may be interstate compacts. We had talked about some regional possibilities here. Could you explain those a little more? What kinds of things are we talking about there? And is there any other precedent for what we might be talking about there? Michelle, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, as Anne mentioned, there were several states that passed state compacts, and this was basically bringing together all of these various segments of society and agreeing to principles of immigration reform. And so that is one kind of state compact, and I'm sure that Anne has a lot more to say about how those were created. And then a slightly different compact is something that I mentioned in the paper as a possibility, that if we were to move to some sort of state-based visa program, states could be given the option to enter into partnerships with one another, so that immigrants that are admitted to work in one state can cross state lines if there's a compact, and that several states can join together to share the immigrants that are admitted.
So we're talking about regional economies or regional areas that cross state lines, like in Washington, D.C., the DMV, the District, Maryland, Virginia is sort of one metropolitan area that shares a workforce and economy in some ways more so than necessarily with the rest of the state. And I think there are other examples as well. And what's your sense? Do you think states are looking at those kinds of ideas as well?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle, for that clarification, because the compact idea in Utah was based on the Mayflower Compact, actually. There was a set of 5 principles, essentially federal solutions, that there should be law enforcement with some discretion, but focus on criminal rather than civil. Families, that there is opposition to policies that unnecessarily separate families, recognition of the economic role of immigrants, and recognition that immigrants are part of society, a free society. So that's within the state that was built on state stakeholders on the principles that they would like to see within their community. And then there's the licensing compacts, for example, the nursing licensing compacts, which are one standard that states can then join that makes it easier for reciprocity between states to have immigrants pass, or nurses, whether they're foreign trained or local, pass back and forth between states without additional licensing requirements.
So that's definitely one of those technical issues, as you said, Michelle, at the beginning, that would have to be worked out at the state level and also at the federal level if they're going to allow such a thing. But to the Congressman's point earlier, that if some states are concerned about cross-border movement, or some stakeholders are concerned about restricting cross-border movement in a geographic area, this might be one way of alleviating some of those questions. So we have a couple of different questions relating to, sort of the issues with the current immigration system and how this might differ from that. So, for example, if you have big companies that are, this question mentions Google and Facebook, that post their jobs in places where there isn't a lot of workforce, so that they can show there isn't workers available, but then maybe move them to other places. I mean, these are questions about the existing H-1B program, or concerns about how the existing H-2A, H-2B programs work right now. How could the state-based proposals address some of those concerns, maybe differently than how the federal programs do? Michelle, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, so I know that by reading the state proposals, there are a lot of concerns with how our current temporary worker programs are working. There were a lot of concerns with the H-2A program for agricultural workers, the H-2B program for seasonal non-agricultural workers. And I think some of the problem is, I mentioned before, that there are numerical caps on these programs. And Most years, there are far more petitions for workers than there are workers available. And so some employers are going to get the short end of the stick, and they're not going to be able to recruit the workers that they need. And I think that there are also concerns about how employers are being asked to determine that they have a need for workers, and how the federal government is determining which employers are able to get workers and which ones are not. So I think there are a lot of concerns there. The state-based visa would kind of allow states to be making those decisions about the need for workers generally across the state, right? Not for one particular corporation or even one particular industry, but to determine, we have seen record population loss in the last 10 years, and we have seen a shortage of workers, and we need additional workers that could be then distributed across the state. So I think that by taking that decision out of the hands of individual employers and putting it in a state agency or state, labor experts that have a better way of determining labor shortages and distributing workers, that might be a potential solution.
Yeah. So, Anne, thinking about that kind of question, states right now are kind of prohibited from, and as you mentioned, and don't really want to enforce civil immigration rules. But if they had state-based visas, would they want to have a little more control, for example, over the labor conditions of the people they recruited? Is that something that states you think would be willing to take on?
I could see this as more of a monitoring role, because the federal government still is in charge of admission and deportation. So if a person violates the conditions of their stay, then a state might be able to say, within a certain time period, you have to notify us that the employment has terminated, and that the next step in immigration benefits has to be pursued, either leaving the country or changing status. But what I wanted to emphasize here is, I think what helps the conversation is, remember, we're trying to propose a better, more flexible legal system. We have a system that has not changed in 30 years. So let's give this a shot and say, on a temporary basis, let's test this out. Let's say we find a state that has really good stats on where their shortages are, where their retirements are likely to be, and say, we know this area needs X workers. And we try them out, we monitor it, we do a study, we say it's a pilot, we sunset it. There's lots of mechanisms you can put into place to say, we know we're doing this for a stated purpose, for a stated time period, to see what success we can have.
Yeah.
That's what governance is, right? Testing.
Yeah, no, you did mention it at one point. So one of the state proposals would let the state sort of monitor recruitment, right? And there is state labor law that applies, right, even in the employment of immigrants, as well as federal law that
right
applies. Would they monitor those kind of things, do you think?
Yeah, I think that was Colorado's intent at the beginning, because it was such a complex system for a farmer who hires 10 people to understand the federal immigration system, pay a lawyer, go through the application process, get the person housing. So they would hire an intermediary, the labor contractors. And this was a way for the state to say, yes, this contractor who works in several states has no violation in our state or in these states. And we perceive them as a safe entity to work with. Yeah. So that's a kind of auditing or monitoring or evaluating that would be helpful.
Yeah. Congressman Hostetler, what do you think Congress's appetite for this would be as a pilot, as a tryout? Would that be easier, do you think, to get passed than maybe a major overhaul?
I think a pilot would be easier to put in place. However, we would have to consider the idea of individuals potentially moving across state lines, and that's why I think it would probably be better. And this is me speaking, and not the Texas Public Policy Foundation, because we haven't moved into this area yet with regard to policy. But I think it would probably be better as a pilot project as possibly an interstate compact that is provided for in Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, where states could enter a compact where there would be, you would see a pilot program that wouldn't include this issue of moving across state lines, would always have that issue. But if you had a pilot project that called into, for example, the West Coast and technical and scientific employees, workers, whereby Washington, Oregon, and California could enter into some interstate compact in a pilot way, whereby they could address issues with regard to workers, and not necessarily just science and technical workers. But I think in order to come to understand the full impact of state-based immigration, a pilot project would probably have to be one of an interstate nature.
Yeah. So another question asks, this particular administration obviously has expressed, I'll say it lightly, skepticism as to the benefit of immigrants in certain ways. The idea of public charge is a big one that this administration has pushed. Are immigrants taking benefits? And I want to ask you, because a lot of the benefits that people are concerned about them taking are actually state-based benefits. How do you think these kinds of proposals might assuage those kinds of concerns of the government, and maybe others have, that immigrants are, taking more than they give, if you want to put it in shorthand?
Well, I think we addressed a lot of this concern back in the 1996 welfare reform law, which basically puts a 5-year bar on any new immigrant coming in for any federal benefits. States are allowed to go back and revisit their laws if they have been providing, say, medical care for certain populations like children. So under the state children insurance program, many states offer that because it's a good cost benefit analysis. You want to treat health problems early, not later. So there's this misperception, I think, that immigrants are just lying around on the public welfare, that they're not actually working and trying to take care of their family and send money home to their families. Most immigrants are not eligible in the first place, and two, not wanting to take them because they're just trying to feed their families. If I could return quickly to I want to make a point about the precedent on Conrad 30.
Mm-hmm.
The Conrad 30 program allows each state to sponsor physicians for a waiver of these are J1 exchange visitors who graduate from U.S. schools and then are required to go back home to their country for 2 years before coming back to the U.S. The Conrad 30 program allows for a waiver to work in underserved places in states. And their requirements is that they have to stay for no less than 3 years. And so that, I think, addresses a little bit of concern of that interstate migration, that they have a dedicated job with a dedicated purpose. The visa is good for that amount of time.
Mm-hmm. So I know, Michelle, you mentioned that in the Canadian program, their green cards, and we had another question that come up. A lot of this discussion is about temporary workers. A lot of the proposals were about, temporary agricultural workers or other workers. But a few are about green cards, and the Australian and Canadian systems primarily are about permanent green cards. Do you think that, there is an issue if you give somebody a green card? Obviously, they can live and work anywhere in the United States. The congressman talked about the concern about people moving across state lines, but the evidence in Canada is that doesn't necessarily happen, correct?
That's right. Based on the latest evaluation that I saw, people that had immigrated to particular regions in Canada tended to stay there. I think that people are coming to the United States to work, and they're going, if they have work there, they're going to remain there. But I also think that this is one of those details that could be resolved, right? Either the federal government could mandate that anybody that comes in on a state-based visa must remain in that state for a certain period of time, or the states could put that type of restriction on their programs if they are given the ability to design their own programs, right? I think that that concern is something that could be pretty easily dealt with.
Yeah. And Anne, you mentioned in the Conrad 30 program, if a state sponsors a foreign physician for that waiver, they are required to work in that state, in that location for a certain period of time. There are other requirements, federal loan forgiveness requires some teachers, for example, to work in certain areas for a certain period of time. Like, those things can be contractually arranged. But Anne, from your conversations, do you think there is any more or less an appetite for states to talk about temporary versus green cards, or do you think it just varies?
Oh man, that's a really good question. So I think where the problem has been for state legislators has been, we want a federal solution. And we have been talking for so long about comprehensive immigration reform. And the big hurdle over that was, what happens to the undocumented population? Do you legalize them? Do you give them a path to residency? Or do we make that a two-step process? So I think there's a lot of nuance going on here about what it includes. But again, going back to this, we're talking about legal workers, and we're trying to say, should you come in for a certain period of time and then leave again? Or how long do you make it renewable? Or at some point they become a part of the community, and there should be an option at a certain point, if they're doing everything right, following the rules, they should be allowed to stay and be a part of the community. Refugees, for example, most people say they want to go home afterwards. And so the idea is that the longer they stay, that they don't have the opportunity to go home, then they adopt their new community. But I think the hard line we've created with our immigration system is you're either in or you're out. And going back to a circular migration possibility there, where you could come and work, go back home, come back and work, make it a more fluid. When the opportunity is here, then there's work for everyone. When there's not opportunity here, then people can go back to their home countries. One aspect to take on it. I know there's more to delve into with that.
Yeah, Congressman Hostetler, I see you nodding at that. Is it? I mean, our system is pretty inflexible. Temporary is temporary, permanent's permanent. You have to choose one or the other. You don't get to kind of go back and forth. What is your sense about those issues? Do you think there's room in Congress to consider that, more of that flexibility?
I think there is more room. And one of the first papers, probably the first paper that TPPF published on immigration, was the history of the border, especially in Texas, regarded the history of immigration, especially in Texas, and the flexibility early on, many years ago, of individuals to go back and forth. And the binary system that we have now the inflexibility does not permit that to a great extent. And that's where states being permitted to address issues in their own economies and their own cultures would permit that. And I think that would have to be that would be the part of a system. Once again, I'm getting a little ahead of myself with regard to my foundation on this issue. But we have seen historically that with regard to crime, with regard to economies, that when migration across the border has been more flexible, there's been less turmoil overall. Now that's been historically. I don't know necessarily that you can take those results to today, but we're not even trying. And as a result, people that would otherwise, one of the most interesting things that I learned as chairman of the subcommittee is the large number of self-deportations that we call them technically self-deportations, that happen every year because individuals go back to their home country whenever times get lean in the United States and the economy doesn't support their presence economically here at that time. And so that's simply a recognition of reality, and a more flexible system that recognizes that, especially on the state level, I think would be beneficial.
Yeah. So Anne, I might ask this question of you. Someone asked, can you speak to how colleges and universities could work with state governments to help inform immigration policies? Do you see that colleges and universities work closely with state legislatures and talk to them about these issues?
Well, I think the area where states have been most involved, of course, has been around in-state tuition kinds of questions and the DACA students, and having them make sure the children who were brought here when they were very young and grew up in American society. A lot of states looked at that population and said, well, we're allowing them to have education K through 12, and then we're just setting them adrift when they are ready to go to college. And so a lot of states have provided for in-state tuition for that. And when they start talking to community colleges and universities, they're saying, well, how can we do a good job making sure they're employed after? And I said, well, you can't, because it takes the federal government to make sure that they're legally authorized to work. So we're kind of caught in a tough place where you're looking at people in your community who need to have education and opportunity, as well as international students who come in and help fund our great colleges, university. It's a higher tuition they pay helps underwrite education for the rest of American students. So I think there's more that we could learn there. I think there's, I worked on a project once in Minnesota where we were looking at 0 to 3 childcare, K through 12, and university, because the universities were looking ahead and saying, if we don't have the proper steps before they get to us, we have to do a lot of remedial work. We don't want to do remedial work. We want to make them excel. And so I think that would be a really great opportunity to look across the spectrum about our education and the success of our young people.
Yeah. Well, and you raised DACA, and one of our other questions, and Michelle, I'll ask you about this. Would or could state-based visa programs deal with undocumented population or DACA people specifically?
That's a great question.
Go ahead, Michelle.
That's a great question. I think it really depends on how the program is designed. We saw some of the state proposals were explicitly regarding the unauthorized population, that the state legislatures wanted to be able to issue work authorization to people who were already working in the state and filling important niches in the labor market, but without proper authorization. I think that if Congress were to pass a bill that allowed some sort of state visa program and gave states the opportunity to choose to use those visas on current unauthorized immigrants, I think that a lot of states would take that opportunity to do so.
Yeah. Let's see. Well, I'm going to ask any of these. I mean, the Farm Worker Modernization Act came up earlier. That is for those who are not familiar, that is a bipartisan bill that was introduced in the House and passed the House. It's now pending in the Senate, which would, do a lot for agricultural work in the United States. It would reform the H-2A temporary agricultural worker program. It would also allow for legalization for many currently unauthorized agricultural workers in the country. This person is just asking whether or not that kind of bill or any of these sort of, that may have bipartisan support can be acted on right now. Congressman Hofstadter, I might ask you, because you're federal policy and you're talking to your colleagues up on Capitol Hill, what's the appetite up there for immigration legislation right now?
Well, overall, it's very, especially comprehensive immigration reform. There's not much of an appetite for it. That's why you saw this very narrowly tailored farm worker program that did receive bipartisan support. I would say that while the Texas Public Policy Foundation did not take an official stance on the legislation, one of the areas that we did have a concern about was ultimately the pathway to citizenship or legalization for individuals in the program and legal permanent resident status. The concern that we have is that this is a cyclical problem. In 1986, the Immigration Reform and Control Act sought to do the very same thing, to meet a demand in the economy for these workers, and a very natural process happened whenever folks ultimately received legal status. They moved out of these lower paying jobs into other paying job that cannot be faulted for. And then came the need for more farm workers in these same areas, and now we're kind of running up against that same cycle. So I think without some recognition, as we mentioned earlier, this issue has a wide spectrum of needs, as well as a wide spectrum of solutions. And one of the solutions has to address the fact that if you want farm workers, if you want seasonal workers, and if you decide to ultimately legalize those seasonal workers, you're going to lose those specific seasonal workers, and they're not going to be there anymore. And history tells us that. And so, is there a system? And there could be a system whereby, as we mentioned earlier, individuals would come and work for a season and go back home, and then come to work for a season and go back to a foreign country if they desire to, and many of them do. So the one issue that did arise under that particular program is we're simply repeating policy of the past and expecting different results, and that's never going to happen.
I'd like to comment too.
Sure, Ann, go ahead.
So what that was really well said. What I'd like to add though is the legislators that I've talked to say that they often have workers from Mexico or Central America or wherever that return year after year after year. But the system is set up where they can't be guaranteed that visa. And so it's a lottery system. This works well for no one. So let us try to have a more flexible system where you can have the circular migration. You have a trusted worker who knows you, your family, the crops, and they get to earn some money, go back home, work their own farms. There's a win-win possibility here, I think.
Yeah, and you're talking practical and pragmatic in
Dang
immigration.
it.
Can those terms coexist? We have another question that asked a very good question, because we've been talking about state-based programs, but we know that even within a state, particularly some large states, the economy is not necessarily the same across the state. So what about efforts to address local or labor market needs? And this question was looking at Illinois, but we could probably apply it to Indiana too, that if Peoria needs workers and Illinois sponsors a state-based visa, why would the worker not move to Chicago? Or in Indiana, if you need them in Evansville, why would they not move to Indianapolis? I think we talked a little bit about how these programs could be framed and set up that might require some period of staying in a particular area. One of the issues is that the current system is employer specific. You're tied to a specific employer. That might not be the case in state-based visa. But what are your thoughts? I'll open this to anyone about involving sub-state governments in the conversation.
Well, the first, I'll jump in. The first example that comes in is the EB-5 investor visa, where states have a role in designating certain areas as of needed investment. And that's where the jobs are. So I'll start with that, and some of the other brilliant minds in the panel can.
Okay, so we already have at least one example in immigration law where states can designate particular sub-state areas as needing.
Yes.
Okay. Michelle, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that a state-based visa system would be more attentive to these types of local needs than the current system. I think that localities could certainly be part of that group of stakeholders that would design a program at the state level. Certainly, localities would have the state legislature's ear. And I think that there are certainly ways to design a system to ensure that those workers that are coming to a particular state can also go to the particular area within that state that need them the most.
Yeah, Congressman Hostetler, what do you think about that one?
Well, Ann suggested that the brilliant minds would chime in, but I'll do it as well. But I think that speaks to the very issue that state legislators deliberate amongst themselves in the same way that federal legislators do, and that states are well capable of making decisions on a regional basis. They do it all the time. State legislators all the time look at one region with regard to others and the needs of those regions. And so I think it's a great question, and it's an obvious concern, but states do it all the time.
Yeah. So going back to what you said earlier, maybe we should trust them a little more.
That's exactly right. Yes.
Well, we are at the end of our time. I want to thank our panelists very, very much. I think this has been a very interesting and informative discussion. We don't have all the answers. I think that's one of the things that's pretty obvious, that we don't know exactly how this could be set up. There's a lot of details to be worked out. But I think what we're all sort of agreeing upon here is that we should look at this seriously, that having states and be able to indicate to the federal government their particular state needs that may differ across the 50 states at different times, and include that input and possibility as part of our national immigration system could have benefits across the system, not just for the states, but for the federal government, for the immigrants themselves. So I thank you all. Michelle, I thank you very much for the paper that you wrote on our behalf. Ann and Congressman Hostetler, thank you so much for participating. We will have a screen that comes up at the end here that has links to everybody's websites and Twitter accounts. So if you want to continue the conversation there, please feel free to do so. we want to thank you for joining us for this webinar. The video of this will be posted up on the Bipartisan Policy website, so feel free to share that for folks who weren't able to join us live. Thank you for your good questions, and thank you very much for your interest, and we hope that you will join us again for another program very soon.